Dark Canyon. Elaine Park, born on September 24, 1996, was 20 years old when she went missing. A lover of musical theater and a dedicated member of various dance companies, she was also an aspiring actress. Her case, along with those of Mitris Richardson, 24, Tristan Baudet, 35, and Matthew Weaver Jr., 21, has left the community of Malibu, California, searching for answers. These cases are connected by the area known as Dark Canyon, which has seen a surprising number of disappearances and murders over the last decade. Despite the passage of time, the families of these victims continue to seek justice and closure. Elaine Park, credited as an extra in popular TV shows such as ER, Mad TV, Desperate Housewives, Crazy, Stupid, Love, and Role Models, had a diverse range of interests. She attended Pierce College in Los Angeles but dropped out to pursue a full-time career. An aspiring rapper, Elaine also expressed herself through spoken word poetry about her life. Despite her talents and accomplishments, Elaine's childhood was marked by a lack of unconditional love, especially after her parents' divorce. Her father even offered to sign away his parental rights and sever ties with his children, a gesture that deeply impacted her and her siblings. Although Elaine's father never officially severed his parental rights, he was not an active presence in her life. Elaine lived with her mother, relying on her financially, but their relationship was reportedly strained. Neighbors often heard arguments late into the night, suggesting ongoing tension. The last confirmed sighting of Elaine Park was during the early hours of January 28, 2017, according to various witnesses and digital records. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Of Korean descent, she had brown hair and wide brown eyes that were usually meticulously lined with eyeliner. She was 5'6" and roughly 8 pounds 125 and was last seen wearing a white sweatshirt or possibly a hoodie and denim shorts or possibly gray sweatpants. Those close to her recall that she often wore a necklace which had an E on it. Elaine's mother, like the parents of the other children lost to the canyon's dark secrets, was at the forefront of the search for her child and was the one who initially agreed to work with journalist Neil Strauss in hopes of raising more money for the search for her daughter. However, in a surprising twist, the investigation into Elaine's disappearance began to shift focus, revealing numerous inconsistencies in the narrative and alibi provided by the person who initially reported her missing, Elaine's own mother, Susan Park. Despite Susan's earlier efforts, working alongside investigative journalist Neil Strauss and his team to find her daughter, recent digital evidence has cast a shadow of suspicion on her involvement, complicating the case and raising new questions about her role in Elaine's disappearance. It was no secret that the mother-daughter relationship was not close. Neighbors recall that they often heard fighting between the two, often late into the night. Elaine's friend Daisy, with whom she lived for a period, says of the relationship between Elaine and her mother, quote, "They just didn't, I feel, like, care enough, which is sad. Her mom would kick her out a lot. Elaine didn't have keys sometimes because her mom would lock her out, literally change the locks." Elaine's mother, Susan, had blamed her daughter for the strain in their relationship, particularly regarding the separation from her father. Sadie, a close friend of Elaine, revealed that Elaine's mother was reportedly very controlling, especially when it came to money. This extended to both the earnings Elaine made as an extra in film and television and a contentious insurance payout, a significant point of tension in their relationship, as shown in their recovered text messages. Although Elaine's phone should have contained crucial messages between her and her mother leading up to her disappearance, Susan claimed she accidentally activated the auto-delete function on the phone when it was returned to her by the police. Despite being advised by private investigator Jodine Serin to stop repeatedly entering the wrong password, which could lead to the deletion of all data, Susan ignored the warning. While much information was lost, Jodine Serin, who took on Elaine's case pro bono, was able to recover the most recent iCloud sync, and the text messages and emails he uncovered painted a troubling picture of Elaine's relationship with her mother. Whereas initially the private investigator was only able to recover a limited amount of data from Elaine's phone and computer when a larger capacity MacBook with a larger drive was provided by Neil Strauss, all of a sudden more text messages began to populate, and a very grim and morbid picture began to take formation. In the messages between her and her mother, Elaine's responses were always conciliatory. She was definitely the more passive of the two. Elaine's friend, Sadie, recalls that prior to her disappearance, Elaine's mother and her argued about a contentiously soon-to-be-acquired insurance payout and how it would be divided. This insurance payment would become the center of controversy when it was discovered that Elaine's mother received the payment on her daughter's behalf 53 days after Elaine went missing, with Elaine's signature being forged on the payout document. In 2016, Elaine and her friend Sadie, who was the driver, had gotten into a car accident. Elaine heroically pulled at the car window's broken glass with her bare hands in order to get the trapped occupants of the other party's car. While her hands were bloodied and cut from this act of good Samaritanship, her body nor her back was actually injured, which is in direct opposition to what she told the insurance company in the ensuing days. Sadie theorizes that it was Elaine's mother who encouraged her to file this claim. Prior to the accident, Elaine loved attending hip-hop concerts, and her injuries did not prevent her from attending the myriad of shows in the ensuing months after the accident. In regards to the impending insurance payout, Elaine emailed her mother in June 2016, "I already know you want the checks for my routing info for the insurance check. Once it arrives, it better be either linked directly to my checking account, or if it's a physical check, directly in my hands, the full amount. I'm going to call the office and make sure you're not pulling any snake shit either." In July 2016, 1 month after this initial email, after an argument between her and her daughter in regards to Elaine going out to eat before seeing the chiropractor who would help bolster the insurance claim's validity, Elaine's mom texted her daughter the word "die" 8 times. On Thursday, January 26, 2017, roughly 2 days prior to her going missing at around 3:30 a.m., Elaine texted her mom a pin of her car's location. She was stranded on a bridge, her car having run out of gas, and while she was waiting for help, her car battery had died as well. Her mother, along with her boyfriend, Jeff, drove out to assist Elaine in jumping her car and getting her gas. Jeff and Susan, Elaine's mother, claimed that after they successfully got Elaine back home, she passed out on the couch. Her mom claims that Elaine was very skimpily dressed in a lingerie type of get-up. Elaine's mother claims that when she and Jeff walked into the living room, Elaine shrieked in surprise and ran to her bedroom. Elaine's mom says that this was the last time she ever physically saw Elaine. Susan then says that she and her boyfriend, Jeff, left the house, and when they returned, they recalled that Elaine was still in her room, though they do not recall seeing or speaking with her. This is the last time her mom and Jeff say they ever physically knew Elaine to be in the home. This was 1 day prior to Elaine's last text communication with Susan, as backed up by Verizon's phone records. On Friday, January 27, 2017, the last day of communication between Elaine and Susan entailed Susan texting Elaine $20 using the quick pay feature of Apple, and Elaine texting back that she'll return her mother the money by 6 p.m. that night. When she still hadn't received the $20 by 7 o'clock that evening, her mom texted Elaine to ask why she hadn't paid her back the money. Elaine, in what would be her last text communication between her and her mother digitally that investigators know of, replies to her mother's text from 2 hours prior stating, "Give me until later tonight." On January 27th, Elaine went to the movies with her on-again off-again boyfriend, Divine Compare, known by his friends as DIV. The film was called The Return of Xander Cage and was playing at the AMC Promenade at 10:45 p.m. The pair Ubered there and back, returning to DIV's affluent family's property at around 1 a.m. in the early morning of January 28th. This is confirmed via surveillance footage from the outside of their home. Less than 5 hours after arriving home from the movies, her boyfriend recalls that for unknown reasons, Elaine woke up in a panic, visibly shaking. She then hastily left. Elaine exits her boyfriend's guest house at around 6 o'clock and 1 second a.m., but the video is cut off at 6 o'clock and 5 seconds a.m. just prior to Elaine actually getting into her car. However, A license plate reader on the compare property verifies that Elaine's Honda Civic did in fact exit the gated community a few minutes later. Some critics point out that it was never clear who was actually driving the car when it exited the compare property, as the only artifact for that is the license plate reader recording and not the actual CCTV footage due to an unfortunate twist of digital fate. The reason investigators do not have the critical footage of Elaine leaving is because before the CCTV could tell police what happened next, the footage cut out. There was a significant mishap involving the police when they attempted to transfer footage from a camera unit to one of their storage devices. This act, which is routine for law enforcement, led to the permanent loss of the footage. Some have criticized the police department for the untrained handling of such a simple procedure, particularly given their ample funding. On January 29th, one day after Elaine left his home in a hurry, Elaine's boyfriend, Div, made a controversial Twitter post. He retweeted a post that read, "If a girl leaves some shit at my crib, it's getting thrown out immediately." Initially, suspicion fell on Div due to the tumultuous nature of his relationship with Elaine. However, there was no evidence, either digital or otherwise, to suggest that he had any further contact with her after her abrupt departure on the morning of January 28th. The Compare family, who were involved in the case, have been cooperative and forthcoming with investigators since Elaine's disappearance. At 10:41 a.m. on that day, Saturday 27th, Susan texts Elaine what she says was a reminder. All records have been deleted, so there is no proof as to what exactly was in the text messages. Susan said that because she didn't receive a response, she called Elaine's phone and says that the phone went to voicemail after 2 rings. Susan then texts Elaine again, although records are lost as to what the text messages specifically contained. However, Susan says she was texting again about the $20. With no response, Susan said she checked Elaine's room and that she noticed Elaine's normal overnight back was gone and that her makeup was also gone. Susan then said that she emailed and tried to contact her via Facebook to no avail. In another interview, Susan mentions that Elaine would often leave for nights on end without contact, so Susan claims that why she was immediately concerned is focused more around Elaine's lack of paying the money back than on Elaine's physical disappearance from the home. Susan Park in an interview says she didn't come home that night. I remember. I stayed home that night. She didn't come home the next morning. Oh wait, was I home? I don't remember. The next day, Sunday, January 29th, Susan decides she wants to file a missing persons report because she says Elaine would have paid her back the $20 and the fact that she hasn't has worried her. On February 1st, after filing a missing persons report, Susan supposedly wrote the following message on the whiteboard on Elaine's room door. Elaine, as soon as you decide to come home and you are home, please let me know at your earliest. I am so worried. I do love you, Mom. This was dated February 1st, 2017. In regards to Susan's whereabouts on Friday night and into Saturday morning, Susan's timeline and alibi are varied. She first claimed she wasn't home but later said the following in regards to the aftermath of Elaine's car running out of gas and her and Jeff having to rescue her prior to her going missing. So because that incident Friday night, Saturday night, middle of the night, I came home. I even told Jeff, I said, I'm worried because she's having car problems. I need to go home. I think I did that consecutively, maybe like 2:30 or 2 o'clock or something or 3 o'clock sometime. As I remember, there was no trace of Elaine. There was no trace. When Anne-Marie, wife to Mike, who's the guitarist for the band in Capus and a major researcher and amateur investigator in the case, alongside Ingrid, Neil Strauss's then wife, questioned Susan on why she would want to be at home when she would have needed Jeff's help with any potential car troubles that may arise, and Susan had no answer. Anne-Marie asked Susan if she was indeed worried about potential car troubles with Elaine, why she would have insisted on coming home in the middle of the night. To that, Susan replied, quote, "Yeah, I just wanted to be home with I don't know, like if you put it that way, I don't have an answer." On February 2nd, 5 days after Elaine was last seen on her boyfriend's home security footage, her car was found, seemingly parked and abandoned, although whether by choice or by force, it is unknown. Elaine's 2015 charcoal gray Honda Civic was found at Coral Beach in Malibu, parked on the shoulder of the 26,000 block of the Pacific Coast Highway. The car's doors were unlocked, and the keys were still in the ignition turned into the on position. The car's battery was dead. Elaine's phone was in the center console, her backpack on the seat, her laptop tucked safely inside along with $30, but while all of the material items that a young person would treasure were found in the car, there was still no sign of Elaine. With no note, no indication of a struggle, and no indication of a robbery, law enforcement bizarrely suggested that this could have been a case of suicide where Elaine simply parked her car and then wandered into the ocean to end her life. No evidence via social media posts, text messages recovered, or eyewitness statements suggest that Elaine was suicidal, and while she, like most 20-year-olds, had her fair share of personal, familial, and relationship issues, by all indications, Elaine's focus was on self-care and positivity. In a seemingly continuous pattern of mistakes and procedural graphs of disastrous proportions by various Southern California law enforcement agencies, including the Glendale Police Department, as well as the Malibu Lost Hills Sheriff's Station and Malibu Search and Rescue, there was absolutely no collection or testing of any of Elaine's mysteriously and abruptly abandoned personal items. With nothing being taken into custody for evidence processing, all of Elaine's belongings were given back to her family. Elaine's mom tells investigative journalist Neil Strauss that instead of preserving the artifacts for future testing or investigation, she washed and put away all of the belongings she received. Such a decision by police to not collect artifacts in the case brought back memories for locals of previous instances of mishap, and many expressed frustration towards the law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting the area. Critics of the investigation questioned why police were not doing more about the fact that young people were going missing from this area in far greater proportion in recent years. A sentiment presumably echoed by the parents of Matthew Weaver and Mitris Richardson as well, who fought tirelessly to get investigators to take the cases of their children's fate more seriously. When asked about Elaine's borrowing of money to feed and transport herself, Susan admits that she did require Elaine to pay her back on a strict and unforgiving schedule through a cash app on their phones. At her mother's meticulous attempt at collecting on the debts, Elaine's friend, Sadie, recalls that Elaine often had to ask her mother for money, and her mother reportedly hounded her to repay on time, even the smallest amount. Elaine told Sadie that her mother had taken roughly $8,000 which she had earned of her own accord from working as an extra on film sets, and Elaine was worried that her mom might take the future insurance settlement as well. Everything was about money, Sadie recalls, and Elaine was never made to feel like a daughter but more like a burden. Other red flags appear besides the lack of clarity surrounding the timeline and alibi of Susan, including the fact that she cleaned Elaine's room in the days after her disappearance and washed all potential evidence received back from police. Susan also disabled and deleted Elaine's iPhone by trying the password fuck as the last attempt, and she did not tell the neighbors that Elaine was missing, nor did she put up any flyers in their neighborhood. Susan admits she never passed out flyers in her neighborhood because she claimed she wanted the focus to be on the Calabasas area, but she also admits that the situation was embarrassing because the neighbors had been privy to her and Elaine's loud arguments, being that their volume was so great it could be heard from neighboring yards. Elaine's mother, Susan, gave a notably erratic and inconsistent explanation for the deletion of her text messages with her daughter. She initially tried to justify her actions by claiming it was a habitual practice to clear her plate of worries, but investigators found this reasoning questionable. If Elaine had supposedly stopped responding to her, they wondered why Susan would delete a thread about a current worry, one that was still unresolved. Without any prompting, Susan then claimed the deletion was an accident, insisting that she had tried to lock the message but accidentally deleted it instead. She went on to explain that she was a new iPhone user, having switched from a Samsung only 2 months prior. However, the problem with this explanation, as pointed out by Strauss in his report, was that Elaine's computer had records of prior text exchanges between Susan and Elaine discussing the issue of locking messages. This contradiction raised further suspicions about Susan's credibility and the authenticity of her claims. And in this archived data, it was clear that Susan was told by her daughter that this function was not something one could do on an iPhone. This was 2 months prior to the supposed attempted locking of the text thread and then the accidental deletion, so why Susan would attempt to do this non-existent action again is confusing to some and evidence of a cover-up to others. While Susan claims her usage of her new iPhone was limited, she actually got her iPhone 2 months prior to her daughter's disappearance, and had already been somewhat trained on the differences in platforms. She specifically was told that she could not lock text messages as one could do in a Samsung phone, yet then goes on to deviate from her original story not 10 minutes after. In her own words, Elaine's mother, Susan, claims that after she receives text messages, she deletes them so as to unclutter her text feed and by extension her mind. In order to prove such habitual actions such as clearing old texts, she shows the investigative journalist her phone, but ultimately this proves quite the contrary, as a cornucopia of old text messages both followed up upon and unfollowed up upon were visible, even though Susan had previously just said she deleted text messages which required no follow-up in order to clear her phone. According to this logic, Susan would have only cleared the text messages which no longer needed to be replied to, but she claimed Elaine's was not one of those and that she was so worried at Elaine's lack of response. Following Susan's own logic, if one is to believe that she is a serial text deleter, but only of texts which have been taken care of and already followed up upon, why did she delete Elaine's? If Susan's anxieties were in regards to the fact that she claimed she was concerned her daughter never texted her back, why delete the unanswered text from the person she was most concerned about? The only records that exist of such text message interactions are through Verizon Wireless, which merely show the numbers that communicated and the times at which they happened, but not the actual content of the messages, which are lost forever. The investigative journalist, Neil Strauss, even candidly comments in his report that he himself is uncomfortable with the obvious contradictions and apparent discrepancies. While the strange deletion of key text messages between Elaine and Susan and the forced auto-deletion of Elaine's phone could be mere coincidence, investigative journalist Neil Strauss later uncovered more disturbing information regarding Susan's new boyfriend, Jeff, via Susan's close friend and confidant. Jeff's wife had passed away 5 or 6 years prior via suicide, and in an interview with a close friend of Susan, she says that she believes that she was told by Susan herself that the wife's suicide was due to an overdose of pills. This fact alone may not seem suspicious, but it is a detail which becomes more eerie and ominous when Strauss recalls that Susan had multiple times herself introduced the prospect that her daughter may have committed suicide. Jeff also mentions suicide as a possibility when there were no outward signs by any human or digital account that Elaine was contemplating hurting herself, or even that she was depressed. 3 weeks after her only daughter went missing, Susan insisted in an interview with ABC News that she just wanted to find Elaine's body. Not Elaine, her body. Many believe that this use of the word body was a strange linguistic distinction to make, especially when no outward signs of a fatality were known to police, as 3 weeks in, Elaine was still being treated as a missing persons case and not a homicide. Susan later said in an interview on CNN's Headline News Network, "I don't know what happened. I just need to find her body. I don't know what happened. I don't know." In a later interview, Susan said, "I thought it might be suicide, but they can't find the body. I still kind of feel in a way that she committed suicide and they just can't find the body in that spot." While Elaine's mother was the person who initially contacted the journalist, it came out that her motivation was more for money, as she believed that interacting with Neil Strauss would result in some sort of payday for her personally in the form of a GoFundMe donation in her name. This was made known to Strauss when it was revealed that Susan had called a man named Brandon, the account executive for the charitable foundation that Mike Enzinger, the guitarist for Incubus, runs. It was found that Susan had called him and told him that the GoFundMe account needed a cash infusion as it had been depleted paying the private investigator, Jodine Brandt. But Jodine Brandt later showed Strauss the original contract signed by both he and Elaine's mother. And it shows that this was a fee-free case, pro bono, and with the exception of the cost of a few reimbursements, he had no record of any spending expenditures which would have been involved with finding Elaine. Many involved wondered what had happened to the rest of the $15,000 in that GoFundMe account, and why would it need more? The friend closest to Susan, outside of her boyfriend, says that Susan seemed to fixate on the belief that Elaine's on-again off-again boyfriend, DIV, was responsible for her not coming home. But despite her outward complaints about DIV, Elaine's mother refused to use the GoFundMe money raised by those concerned in order to pay a paltry fee of less than $30 for an official record of DIV's phone. Well, Jodine, and that close friend of Susan's, would recall how she would wax on regarding her belief that DIV was involved. The fact that she hoarded the GoFundMe money claiming that she might need it for funeral expenses when it could have gone towards real answers was highly suspicious to Jodine, the private investigator, and one of the first red flags for him. While Susan told her friend that she believed Elaine's boyfriend to be involved, this was a deviation from the narrative that Susan perpetuated regarding Elaine's possible suicidality or prostitution connections, as Susan later changed her story in subsequent interviews, and she would later go on to imply that sex work could be a possible reason for Elaine's disappearance. Susan postulates that Elaine may have willingly gone into prostitution, or possibly that she was trafficked, a claim with no substantiation. Susan allowed the investigative journalist and his team to look at the items that had been in Elaine's car, which had been returned untested by police. Upon the initial inspection of those items, the lead singer of Incubus, Mike, also working on this case, recalls that the entire situation seemed almost staged as a business card Elaine had been given advertising exotic modeling or perhaps dancing was prominently displayed in her bag as if put there on purpose. Later, Susan showed an uncomfortable and actively protesting Neil Strauss some lingerie from Elaine's bedroom drawer. She said, quote, "It's like a leather kinky stuff. You know, I would never even touch it. The reason why I mentioned it is that because at one point, they mentioned about if she's doing prostitution." Susan also gave Elaine's 2 cats, Coco and Bandit, up for adoption mere months after her disappearance. With all the red flags, it was arranged by Jodine Brandt under the guise of more collection of possible data to have sent dogs come to inspect the Park home. Cadaver dogs usually require training for about 18 to 24 months and are highly effective. They have an accuracy of about 95% when it comes to detecting the chemicals which mark human remains. They are so specialized that they can sometimes smell a body that's been buried up to 15 feet below ground. Their sense of smell is so good that they can detect 1 drop of blood in 13 million gallons of water, allowing them to detect remains which have been submerged underwater for up to 30 meters. They are highly trained in distinguishing between human remains and animal remains and will not mistake one for the other. On May 6, 2017, 2 cadaver dogs searched the home of Elaine and Susan Park, and while this was 6 months after Elaine's disappearance, the specialized nature of such animals makes this time passage less important. In fact, the Journal of Archaeological Method and Theory found that dogs could detect the telltale chemicals of death even 100 years later. The first cadaver dog showed what is called focused interest in Elaine's bedroom. From the report itself written by the handler of the 2 cadaver dogs, he says, quote, "Upon smelling the outside of the bedroom door, the first dog smelled, sat and looked at me, indicating an alert of an odor in which he has previously been trained. He also alerted on the floor molding in the hallway near this door, in a small closet with cleaning supplies in the hallway and in the clothes closet. Opening the closet door, he continued to show this focused interest in the contents, especially the suitcase and other items just inside the closet door. The only area of additional interest was a covered storage shed. The first dog showed interest in the shed area but did not single out one specific spot. Curiously, on March 31, 2017, 2 months after Elaine's disappearance, Susan made a calendar entry in her iPhone for 9 a.m., with the reminder to hide it. This timing coincided with the day that investigators were scheduled to visit Elaine's room at 10:30 a.m., just an hour and a half after the calendar alert. Later that same day, after all investigators had left, Susan made another calendar entry at 1:30 p.m., reminding her to put back hide items shed. These entries raised questions about Susan's actions and intentions surrounding the investigation. All gathered evidence, including emails, text messages, insurance documents, and the cadaver dog report, has been submitted to the authorities, and the case remains open and active. The Glendale Police Department welcomes any assistance from the public, no matter how small it may seem. Tips or information can be shared directly with local investigators. To provide any helpful details, you can contact Sergeant Ernesto Gaxiola or Sergeant James Ross at 818-548-4067. Moving on to the next case. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He earned this nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River in Washington state. Ridgway worked as a painter for a truck company for many years. His parents were Mary Rita and Thomas Newton Ridgway, and he had 2 brothers, Gregory and Thomas Edward. Throughout his life, he had 3 marriages, first to Claudia Craig Barrows from 1970 to 1972, then to Marcia Lorraine Brown from 1973 to 1981, and finally to Judith Lorraine Lynch from 1988 to 2002. Gary Ridgway had 1 son, Matthew. He was convicted of 49 murders that occurred between 1982 and 1998, with some cases possibly stretching as late as 2001. This made him the second most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, based on confirmed cases. Ridgway had been a suspect in these murders since 1982, when he was arrested for solicitation related to prostitution. However, investigators were unable to make a direct link between him and the crimes at that time. Detectives were unable to confirm Gary Ridgway's involvement in the murders until 2001, when advances in DNA technology allowed them to match a saliva sample from him, collected in 1987, to DNA found on several victims. He was arrested on November 30, 2001, as he was leaving the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, Washington. Over 10,000 pieces of evidence had been collected, logged, and stored in preparation for trial when Ridgway was apprehended, according to Dave Reichert of the King County Sheriff's Office. At the time of his arrest, investigators discovered that Ridgway was not very accurate in associating specific dump sites with his victims. Since his arrest, he has led investigators to the remains of 3 additional victims, but he was incorrect about the identity of 2 of them. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 cases, and in 2011 to his 49th case. On December 18, 2003, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As part of a plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the locations of still missing women, he was spared being executed. He is imprisoned at the Washington State Penitentiary Walla Walla. Most of Ridgway's victims were alleged to be prostitutes and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including underage runaways. His victims ranged in age from 14 to 38. In one of his confessions, Ridgway explained that he targeted prostitutes because he believed they were less likely to be missed. Patty Eakes, one of the prosecuting attorneys, found Ridgway's lack of emotion during his eventual admission to the crimes deeply troubling. She described him as appearing like an average, somewhat goofy middle-aged man, which may have led some victims to feel comfortable getting into his truck, believing he posed no real threat. I think he looked for vulnerable women. He had this strange underlying need to feel like he had a beautiful woman by his side. Often, the women that he picked up were attractive. He wanted to be one of those guys who was like, I have a beautiful woman with me. He did not necessarily feel like he had that in his personal life. Physical attractiveness was certainly a factor in his choice of victims, according to Ridgway. He eventually led investigators to a site by the Green River, where on August 21, 2003, they uncovered 23 human bones and teeth, catalogued only as Bones 20. After 2 decades, in 2023, Othram was able to identify the victim as Tammy Lyles, using DNA extracted from the severely degraded skeletal remains. David Middleman, CEO of Othram and a molecular biophysicist, explained that the DNA was in very poor condition due to degradation. The company worked to build a new DNA profile based on the sample. Authorities contacted her mother, and using her reference sample, scientists were able to identify Tammy. Tammy's skull and other remains were found on April 23, 1985 at the Tualatin Golf Course near Tigard, Oregon. It was identified in March 1988 using Tammy's dental records. In 2003, her brother, Jason Miles, said that when her family buried her in the 1980s, They had to use a baby casket because we could not find all the parts of her body. You live with this for 20 years wondering what happened. I cannot see myself ever finding closure, but I think it would settle a lot better if the guy would say, yeah, I did it. Tammy was a 16-year-old girl whose life was brought to an end in 1983. She stayed in Everett, Washington. She disappeared from downtown Seattle, Washington on June 9, 1983. In 2023, King County Sheriff Patricia Cole Tyndall said that Tammy's family does not want to speak to the media. We appreciate your support in granting the family the privacy they seek during this time, Cole Tyndall said. This breakthrough in the case comes after 15-year-old Lori Henry Spotnick was identified as another victim of Ridgway's. Lori was born on November 13, 1967 and stayed in Juneau, Alaska. She disappeared in 1982 after a fight with her mother. She wanted a horse. A friend had one. All Lori had to do, she told her mom, was pay for feed and pay rent for the stall. Donna Hurley, her mother, said no. She did not have the money. She did not have the time. Her husband had passed away a decade prior. She was a single mother raising 2 teenagers. It was not practical. Lori's disappearance would remain a mystery, an open wound, an aching phantom limb for more than 4 decades until her remains were identified as one of at least 49 victims. For 76-year-old Donna, Lori's disappearance, her absence, her demise have been an ever-present void for more than 40 years. I guess everybody calls it closure, but to me, it was just a relief, Donna said of Lori's identification. All of the what-ifs, how come, where has she been, all the questions that go through your mind, you quit trying to fool yourself that she is alive and well, raising a family, and everything is good. It is just a relief that all of that is off your shoulders and off your mind. As a mother, part of me was still in denial. You build a wall around these things, she said. The tough thing is those walls start to crumble. Lori, she said, was a firecracker, interested in everything: sports, the outdoors, horses, dogs, and cooking. She played baseball and ran track. She liked to snowmobile. At 7, she trained the family Labrador Retriever, Ebony's Flippy Miss, but known as Flip, and showed her in a dog show. She could get us without opening her books, Donna said. She did speak with her daughter one time after she ran away. It was Thanksgiving, either 1982 or 83. Lori called her grandparents home where the family was gathered. She told them she would be sending Christmas presents. She said she was living in Seattle, and she was happy. Lori's remains were discovered on December 30th, 1985, about 3 years after she ran away from home, and was marked as Bones 17. Parabon Nanolabs chief genetic genealogist, Cece Moore, did the genetic genealogy work. She works like a detective using partial matches across many generations and multiple family trees to try to create a family tree, a lineage for the unknown person. She knew she was looking for a teenage girl, but Lori had left little trace. She was so young when she disappeared. She disappeared before social media, before online people searches, before the internet. She never voted, never bought property, never paid taxes. Moore scoured census records, birth announcements, yearbook photos. She came up empty. Then she stumbled upon an obituary. One paragraph on page 62 of the January 19, 1972 Seattle Times. Raspatnik, William S. of Juneau, Alaska, formerly of Seattle. Husband of Donna, father of William George and Lori Ann. Donna, she knew about. William George, Lori's brother, she knew about. She wrote a report and sent it to King County. And then more than a year after Moore started searching, more than 40 years after Lori disappeared, 2 detectives showed up on Donna Hurley's doorstep. DNA was matched to a saliva sample from Donna to identify her. Donna had left Centralia, Pennsylvania and moved to Juneau, Alaska in the 1980s. Her parents lived there, and the job prospects were better. She worked in the hotel business for a decade, at a veterinarian's office for 13 years, then for the Alaska Department of Education. Now retired, she has 2 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. They are Lori's great and great-great-nieces and nephews, although they have never met her. Lori's brother passed away in 2010 of cancer just like her father. Over the years, Donna saw news coverage of the Green River perpetrator. She thought about it from time to time. We were in Alaska. We were so far removed, she said. I was still raising my son. I was trying to push all of it out of my mind. Law enforcement would post pictures and police sketches of victims. I never saw anyone that I felt looked like Lori, she said. Police posted a composite image of Bones 17, what they imagined she might look like based on DNA. Blondish hair, blue-green eyes, fair complexion. It took me a long time to admit it looked like her, Donna said. The composite image had straight hair, she thought to herself, but Lori had curly hair. A lot of it was denial. You become numb at a certain point. It is just she paused, searching for words. It makes me sad that her life ended that way, makes me angry at the person who did it, makes me angry at myself that I could not stop it. And at a certain point, you just have to realize that you have another part of your family that you have to keep going forward for. Lori's idol, Donna said, was her dad. She does not think Lori ever got over his passing when she was only 5. She was Daddy's little girl. She had the curly ponytails and the big blue eyes. She plans to bury Lori at Evergreen Washelli Cemetery in Seattle next to her dad. Dave Reichert with the King County Sheriff's Office said that although the last remains in the medical examiner's office have been identified, there are still more unsolved cases. Ridgway confessed to taking the lives of 65 to 70 young women and little girls, although he has pleaded guilty to 49, and 51 cases have been officially closed. While there are still unsolved cases that may or may not be linked to him, there are parents still searching for answers regarding their missing daughters. On April 21, 2023, Washington State Governor Jay Inslee signed legislation removing the death penalty from the state's law. However, according to the King County Prosecutor's Office, if Ridgway is convicted of additional killings outside Washington, he could still face the death penalty. Moving on to the next case. Jack the Stripper. The Jack the Stripper case is a chilling part of London's dark history, echoing the terror caused by Jack the Ripper nearly a century earlier. Between 1964 and 1965, the killer targeted women, primarily prostitutes, in West London. The victims were found stripped of their clothing, leading to the nude murders moniker, and many had been asphyxiated, though there were signs of violence suggesting a complex and brutal method of control. The killer's choice to use asphyxiation rather than knives or guns made this case particularly unsettling, and the lack of physical evidence made it difficult for the police to track him down. Despite numerous leads, suspects, and theories, the killer was never caught, and the crimes remain unsolved to this day. Some speculated that the killer was a man of normal appearance who blended in with the community, which made him hard to identify. The connection to the Ripper case, with the target group of prostitutes and the absence of solid clues, suggests a disturbing pattern in the history of London's criminal underworld. Even though the case is over 50 years old, it continues to fascinate both true crime enthusiasts and those researching the psychology of serial killers. The discovery of this young woman's body on June 17, 1959, marked the beginning of what would become the Jack the Stripper case. The circumstances surrounding her death were eerily similar to the later murders attributed to the serial killer, though at this point, police had no reason to believe that a series of killings was underway. The woman's body was found stripped of clothes, which indicated that the killer had a particular modus operandi, similar to the pattern seen in the later victims. The fact that she had been strangled also pointed to the killer's preference for asphyxiation rather than other methods of murder. The location, Duke Meadows, was a known area where sex workers met clients, which led investigators to believe that the victim may have been a prostitute. However, her identity remained unknown, and like the later victims, there were no personal belongings or identifying information found on the body. The lack of clues and the absence of a clear suspect left police with little to go on, but it was a case that would come to be linked with a series of other unsolved murders in the coming years, all of which pointed to the same killer, eventually dubbed Jack the Stripper. The Chiswick murder was likely the killer's first, setting the stage for a brutal killing spree that would terrorize London for the next several years. The case is a haunting reminder of how a series of seemingly isolated incidents can eventually point to a dangerous serial killer, whose identity remains elusive to this day. Her underwear and shoes were missing, as were her purse and any other identification. Her dress was torn at the waist and open to reveal her breast. The pathologist concluded that a death had occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. on June 17th. A post-mortem photo of her face was circulated in the newspapers. And Elizabeth Figg was identified first by her flatmate and fellow sex worker, Pauline Mills, and later by Figg's mother. Elizabeth was a prostitute who worked on the street nearby, and police theorized that she had been murdered by a man who had picked her up for sex the night before. A witness said that on the night of the murder, he and his wife had observed the car's headlights as it parked in that area at 12:05 a.m. Shortly after the lights were switched off, they heard a woman scream but thought nothing of it at the time. Police questioned many people and searched the area but came empty-handed. With little evidence and no leads, the case into her murder soon went cold. 4 years later, Welsh-born Gwyneth Rees was found dead in a rubbish tip on November 8, 1963. Investigators later felt Rees may have been a stripper victim due to her being found near the River Thames and because she had been strangled with ligature. Several of her teeth were also missing. She had been missing for 9 days, with the last known sighting of her being getting into a van on September 29, 1963. Although there were similarities between Elizabeth Figg's murder and Gwyneth Rees's murder, no links were made at that stage. And the case of Gwyneth Rees joined many other London unsolved mysteries lying cold in the police case file. On February 2, 1964, the first confirmed victim of Jack the Stripper, Hannah Tilford, was found floating in the Thames River by a passing boat. She had been in the water for 2 to 7 days and was found naked apart from her stockings, which had been rolled down to her ankles. Her underwear had been forced down her throat, and at least one of her front teeth were missing. Despite being obviously strangled, her cause of death was drowning. She was reported missing 10 days prior to her discovery. Across the next 12 months, a further 5 bodies would be found. All young women, all prostitutes, and all found stripped and either drowned or strangled. 2 months later, after Hannah's body was discovered, on April 8, 1964, Irene Lockwood was found drowned on the foreshore of the Thames at Corning Reach, Chiswick, just a mile away from where Hannah's body was found. Her cause of death was also ruled as drowning, and she was 4 months pregnant when she was murdered. Police quickly linked her murder not only to Hannah Tilford's but one of the early possible victims, Elizabeth Figg. Weeks after the discovery of her body, a local caretaker, 57-year-old Kenneth Archibald, confessed to killing Irene Lockwood at a Notting Hill police station and was subsequently charged with her murder. But it was later deemed a false confession due to inconsistencies in his version of events. He later recanted his statement, citing depression, and was cleared at trial. Just days after discovery of Irene Lockwood, another body was found, giving police their third suspicious death of a young prostitute in less than 3 months. On April 24, 1964, Helen Barthelm's naked, tattooed body was found, not on the riverbank but in an alley 4.5 miles northwest of the location of Irene Lockwood's body near the Boston Manor playing fields. The area was fairly secluded, allowing the killer privacy to dispose of the body. It was this crime scene that gave detectives their first real clue. Helen had been strangled most likely up to 24 hours earlier. But most importantly, flakes of automotive paint were found on her body. This discovery led police, who by now had started to suspect that they were dealing with a serial killer, to believe she had been stored in a workshop or warehouse of some sort. Detectives believed their suspect was a paint sprayer. Like Hannah Tilford, Bartholomew was also missing several front teeth, 3 to be exact. Then, on July 14, 1964, 30-year-old Marie Fleming was found nude and seated in an upright position at the entrance to a garage in Chiswick, which was 1.8 miles from where Hannah Tilford's body was found. Her dentures were missing as well, and it was thought that she had been smothered to death. Paint specks were also found on her body, just as with Helen Bartholomew. Many locals reported hearing a vehicle, probably a van, reversing down the street shortly before her body was discovered, though none could identify the car or the driver. For the next 3 months, all went quiet until November 25 when 21-year-old Margaret McGowan, also known as Frances Brown, was found in a car park on Houghton Street, Kensington. Brown was last seen alive on October 23, 1964 by a colleague and fellow sex worker, Kim Taylor, who saw her getting into a client's car. Taylor was able to provide a composite of the man that picked her up as well as a description of the car he was driving. Kim thought it was either a Ford Zephyr or a Zodiac. Her cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation. One of her front teeth had been forced from its socket, and police noted traces of now familiar paint flecks on her body as well. Jack's last known victim was Bridget O'Hara. She was last seen in early January 1965. Her body was found 1 month later on February 16, hidden amongst bushes on the Huron Trading Estate in Acton. Traces of paint flecks were discovered on her body as well, but turned out to be industrial paint, not automotive. The paint flecks was sourced to a nearby transformer. Bridget's front teeth were also missing, and investigators determined she died on her knees. Her corpse was partially mummified either from prolonged storage in a cool, dry place or possibly from the heat of the transformer. A massive hunt for Jack the Stripper was led by Chief Superintendent John Rose of Scotland Yard. He had policewomen dressed up as prostitutes to walk the streets of Notting Hill in the hope of catching the killer. He also sent officers across West London to look for paint spraying sites. They didn't have to look far. The paint pattern was found opposite a paint spray shop on the Huron estate not far from where Bridget O'Hara's body was found, which forensics were able to match exactly to those found on the bodies. John DeRose concluded that this was where the bodies were stored before being dumped. Detectives believed the killer must have had some association with the estate and questioned 7,000 people from the area. However, no information could be found on the identity of the killer. In an attempt to force the killer into exposing himself, John DeRose held a news conference falsely announcing that the police had narrowed the suspect pool down to 20 men. After a short time, he announced that the suspect pool contained only 10 members and then 3. However, after months of searches and interviews, the case reached a dead end. And with no new murders after February 1965, no further evidence was gained. For John DeRose, the most likely suspect was a Scottish security guard called Mungo Ireland. Mungo Ireland had a pretty bleak childhood in Scotland, punctuated by frequent beatings. He served in World War II, where he developed a taste for hiring sex workers. He worked as a police officer briefly but quit after being passed over for detective. Ireland drove a van like the one seen in Chiswick where Mary Fleming was found. He worked the overnight shift 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. just like police suspected the killer would, and he also worked on the estate as a security guard where Bridget O'Hara's body was found. In March 1965, a month after the final murder attributed to Jack the Stripper, Mungo Ireland committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning inside his garage. He left a suicide note for his wife which said, "I cannot stand the strain anymore and finished to save you and the police looking for me. I'll be in the garage." His decision to take his own life and the timing arose further suspicion that Mungo Ireland was indeed Jack the Stripper. However, some serious doubts were raised on Ireland being a credible suspect when it was discovered he didn't begin work on the estate until after the bodies of Helen Bartholomew and Mary Fleming were found. He was also in Scotland when Bridget O'Hara was murdered. Various other suspects had been put forward, including light heavyweight champion boxer Freddie Mills. In July 1965, not even 5 months after O'Hara's body was found, Mills was found dead in his car in an alley in Soho. He had a gunshot wound to the head and a rifle between his knees. His family and friends believed he had been murdered, but the police ruled his death a suicide. Some believed Mills was the killer and had taken his own life, as he thought the police were getting close to arresting him. However, no evidence has ever been found to link Freddie Mills to the killings. David Seabrook in his book Jack of Jumps wrote that a former Metropolitan Police detective was also a suspect in the opinion of several senior detectives investigating the case. This particular police officer was convicted of various petty crimes while he was serving as a police officer and was sentenced to prison time. It is theorized that because he committed robberies to make his fellow officers look stupid, that upon his release from prison, he graduated to murder for the same reason. Detective Superintendent William Baldock investigated the former Metropolitan Police detective as a suspect in the murders, but failed to build a case. Tommy Butler, who was a Scotland Yard superintendent at the time of the murders, is another name which appeared as a possible suspect, although he was appointed by former criminal Jimmy Evans in a book he wrote about his life. His allegations were quickly dismissed as being offered by a man with a grudge against a police officer with no evidence to back up his claims. Probably the most credible suspect was Harold Jones. Jones killed 2 girls in 1921 in the town of Hospitaller. His first victim, 8-year-old Frida Burnell, was found sexually assaulted and murdered, but he was acquitted. That acquittal was celebrated by his neighbors, who didn't believe he could possibly be guilty. 15 days later, his neighbor's 11-year-old daughter, Florence Little, was found dead in Jones' attic, drained entirely of blood. Because he was 15 at the time, he was not liable for death penalty, instead receiving a life sentence. He was let out 20 years later for exemplary behavior. In 1941, at the age of 35, after being released from prison, he is believed to have returned to his hometown of Adelori and visited the graves of his early victims. In 1947, he surfaced in London, married and had a daughter, and lived 2 streets away from Mungo, Ireland. Due to poor record-keeping, he was never looked at by the police. In 2011, Neil Milkins published Who Was Jack the Stripper?, in which he alleges that the culprit was Harold Jones, but all the evidence is based on coincidence. He reported in his book while researching Jones' movements that Jones had been working as a sheet metal worker living just streets away from Heron Trading Estate at the time of Jack the Stripper's murders and would have used industrial paint spray. There were other similarities as well. The victims of the stripper had been stored prior to disposal. Jones was also thought to have stored his victims as well. Jones kept his victims' handkerchiefs. The stripper was thought to keep his victims' teeth. 5 years before Hannah was murdered, Jones lived just 2 streets away from her. He later moved to Hammersmith under another assumed name, and lived 2 streets away from both Margaret McGavin and Bridget O'Hara. Despite the early similarities between the murder in Chiswick and the later killings attributed to Jack the Stripper, Harold Jones was never considered a suspect in the case. His death in 1971 marked the end of any potential investigation into him. In fact, without any concrete leads or further evidence linking him to the crimes, the case remained open but dormant for many years. The lack of a clear suspect, coupled with the scarcity of clues left at the crime scenes, meant that the identity of Jack the Stripper would continue to elude the police. The case became another one of London's many unsolved mysteries, with the fear of a lurking killer hanging over the city. The gruesome and bizarre nature of the killings, as well as the lack of identifying evidence, would ensure that the story of Jack the Stripper remained unresolved. While several theories have circulated over the years, none have been definitively proven, and the true identity of the killer remains a mystery. As time passes and the case becomes more distant, it seems likely that the murders of Jack the Stripper will remain unsolved, leaving a chilling legacy of a killer who was never caught. Moving on to the next case. Jodine Serin. Jodine Serin lived in San Diego, California in 2007. She was mentally disabled but was highly functional and had a strong desire to help others. Jodine volunteered at her church and the San Diego Humane Society and was actively involved with the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. She had a deep love for animals and enjoyed activities such as biking, kayaking, and walking on the beach. She lived alone in a ground-level condo in Carlsbad, California that her parents bought for her. On Valentine's Day 2007, Jodine's parents went to check up on her to make sure everything is okay. Everything was not okay. Inside of the condo, her parents found a man that they did not know. They told him to leave. When they entered Jodine's room, they found that she had been assaulted and strangled. Despite seeing the attacker's face, the case would take over a decade to be solved. In 2018, investigators decided to contact a company that you might have heard of, Parabon Nanolabs. The company specializes in something called DNA phenotyping. This is a process of using unidentified DNA evidence left behind at a crime scene to predict someone's physical appearance and ancestry. It is used by law enforcement to generate leads in criminal investigations, narrow suspect lists, and identify unknown remains. Parabon Nano Labs created this image to show what the attacker may have looked like back in 2007. They also made use of genetic genealogy. This is a process where they use DNA evidence found in the crime scene to create the family tree of the suspect. It finally led investigators to David Mabrito. He was a transient and took his own life in 2011. It was David's relatives who entered their DNA to a public DNA database and led investigators to him. The Oceanside Police Department in California was also able to help. They had a sample of David's DNA they collected at a traffic stop. This DNA also matched the DNA found at a crime scene and confirmed that David took the life of Jodine Serin. Her family expressed in a statement, "There was joy in her laughter, love in her heart, and faith in her soul." They also conveyed their gratitude to the Carlsbad Police Department for their dedicated efforts in achieving justice. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.